Hello and welcome to this webinar on board evaluations presented by Corporate Secretary Magazine, along with our partner and sponsor for this event, Diligent Board Member Services. I'm Neil Stewart. I'm Editorial and Research Director at Corporate Secretary, and I'm your moderator today. Now, as we go along with this webinar, we will welcome questions from the audience. Just click on the Ask a Question button on your webinar screen and type in the question. We are also live tweeting this event, hashtag CSM Webinar for Corporate Secretary Magazine Webinar, hashtag CSM Webinar on Twitter. We have an excellent group of registrants in our audience. We have tracked the registration. Slightly over half, about 55%, are located in the U.S., another 25% in Canada, UK, the rest of the world account for the rest. About 70% of the people listening are in-house, are corporates, and some of them are even directors. And there are, of course, many corporate secretaries, GCs, and the like, but we have some directors in the audience as well. Now let's meet our speakers. I'd like to ask each of them to give us a little bit of sense of their background and who they are, starting with Suzanne Rich-Folsom, General Counsel and Senior Vice President of Governmental Affairs at U.S. Steel.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Happy to be here with you again, partnering on another program. I am, as you mentioned, the General Counsel of U.S. Steel. The Corporate Secretary function reports to me. In my earlier career, I've served as the Corporate Secretary also. I'm at U.S. Steel and helping to restructure the company, and thrilled to be here at the iconic American company that was a foundation of manufacturing in America. So happy
Thanks,
to be here.
Suzanne. And, of course, an amazing background as General Counsel, Chief Compliance Officer previously at Academy, and before that, Deputy General Counsel, Chief Regulatory and Compliance Officer for AIG. So some really high-pressure situations in your past, Suzanne, but some amazing experience. Susan Ellen Wolf is CEO of Global Governance Consulting. Susan, give us a sense of your background.
Sure, Neil. I spent 25 years in-house, first as a securities and M&A lawyer and later as a chief governance officer. And I was lucky enough to see from the in-house perspective some of the best boards in the country in action, including Coca-Cola and predecessors of Merck, Exelon, and Verizon. I founded Global Governance Consulting about 4 years ago, and we lead boards through the self-evaluation process, always with a view towards making their work to drive value creation over the long term more effective.
Excellent. Thanks, Susan. And I wanted to note to our audience that we've made available 2 documents from Susan for download. If you click on the Resources tab at the bottom of your webinar screen, you can find 2 PDFs to download. One is a presentation that outlines Susan's oral method of assessment as somewhat of an alternative to a written one. And the other document is a list of things to consider when choosing a method and design for a particular company at a particular time. It was developed by Susan along with some colleagues from other firms. So I encourage the audience to check those out. And finally, Jeffrey Powell is Executive Vice President, Director of Sales for Diligent Board Member Services. Jeffrey, good to talk to you again. Give us a sense of your perspective on this.
Hi, Neil. Well, of course, it's great to be here. Diligent has a long-standing relationship with Corporate Secretary, and happy to be here on another webinar. As I hope many of the participants are aware, Diligent Board Books is, of course, the world's leading secure board portal, which is, of course, an electronic way for our clients to distribute materials to their boards, including D&O questionnaires and, of course, a way to electronically perform board evaluations.
Good. Okay. Thanks, Jeffrey. Now let's get going. This is going to be a quick webinar. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground in the next 30 minutes or so. During the webinar, we'll be asking the audience some polling questions. So right off the bat, let's ask the first question. Get this one out of the way. So this is a key question. Have you recently upgraded or changed the focus of your board evaluation process? So let's push that out to the audience. And as the audience is voting on this, I mean, maybe, Suzanne, you could start to give a little bit of a sense of the context in which we're talking here. What are some of the forces driving this new focus on board evaluations?
Sure. Thanks, Neil. Well, first of all, we all know that board evaluations are really important for improving corporate governance. We know that shareholders and investors want to see that a board is self-critical and willing to address identified weaknesses. And then obviously if you're a New York Stock Exchange listed company, they require full board and key committee evaluation. So for those of us at companies like U.S. Steel, we are required to have in place this process, and for those that are not, it's a key consideration because of corporate governance demands in today's corporate America, or corporate world.
But I want to follow up on that point in particular. Let's look at the results now of our audience poll, and we can see that exactly half, in fact, either plan to in the coming year or have in the past year upgraded or changed the focus of their board evaluation process. So that is a good proportion, although then again, glass half full, 50% of not. Susan, maybe you could weigh in, give us a sense of some of the forces driving board evaluation. I mean, Suzanne alluded to some shareholder pressure, regulatory pressure, but there are business drivers too, aren't there?
There sure are. I think, in the first few years when the evaluations were required every year, good boards were doing some kind of a process to self-improve when needed. It might not have been every year, but it was periodic. And then when all boards were required to do it and you saw a lot of focus around requirements, people started using questionnaires and they got longer and longer, and they focused a lot on checklists of all the requirements, and directors became frustrated because it was a waste of time. And so the best boards, again, started looking for new processes that were very targeted and helped them focus on ways that they could help management drive value creation over the long term. And that, I think, was the primary driver in changing processes. Second was also some worry over litigation. Some companies were having discovery requests for the questionnaires, and so that also led a push towards a more oral process.
All right, so definitely strong impetus for board evaluations, and it is interesting to hear right now companies that are engaging with their institutions about governance issues are telling me that they're very concerned about board renewal, board refreshment, board composition, skills of directors, and they're very curious about what kind of evaluations are going on. So there's definitely a lot of momentum here. All right, well, let's start to get into some of the considerations. And Suzanne, maybe you could start here. I'm going to go to your first slide, and starting with the scope of the evaluation, talk about how designing a board evaluation.
Well, I think it's important to note that recent studies have shown that 98% of listed boards out there conduct some form of evaluation. Only about 53% also conduct committee evaluations, and then about 33% conduct director evaluations in addition to the others. So I think it's important to look at that. While companies are, and this includes companies that are also not listed. Having been at a private company before, it's important, we realized it was important to the governance of our company, even though we were not required to conduct some form of evaluation. So as you're looking at putting the evaluation together, you make the decision, do you go beyond just the full, what committees do you need to look at? And then I think it's important, Susan raised some points about, do you want to do written questionnaires or oral interviews, because you've got to take into consideration, litigation type issues. And also the comfort level of your board. How many years have they been on the board? What would they be comfortable with? So there's no one right answer or model for every company. It's going to depend upon your company, your industry, I think the tenure of your board members, and the types of litigation that you have previously faced that are going to inform the type of process you put in place.
Now, one of the options, of course, here are individual director evaluations, whether it's self-assessment or peer evaluations. Susan, you take a dim view of individual director evaluations. Is that right?
I usually don't recommend them unless there's some specific thing going on at a company that makes it necessary. I have found that if you do a good job of assessing the things that are helping the board function well and the things that are getting in the way, if an individual has a problem, it comes up anyway. And we have found that, regardless of the method and who's running it, there are some unintended bad consequences sometimes from the individual evaluations. It's hard to get subjective data from these kinds of questions, so you often end up perhaps with someone having a low score who still adds a critical piece of value to the board's work and might then feel that he wants to move on to another board if he doesn't feel valued. Sometimes we see it increase silos on the board or competitiveness, so you have to be very careful if you're going to use it. I think the more important thing is to figure out what's helping the board work well and what's getting in the way, and then if one of those is a person or a personality or behavior, address that.
Okay, now it's come up a couple of times already, written versus oral. Let's find out now how those in our audience doing formal evaluations do it. So let's ask our audience the next polling question. If you do a formal board evaluation, what does it consist of? Is it a written questionnaire, an online questionnaire, an oral-only process, or both oral and written or online? And Jeffrey, maybe you could, as the audience is answering this, maybe you could introduce us to how online questionnaires are being done, especially via portals now.
Sure. I'm happy to. I'd like to echo a little bit what both Suzanne and Susan were talking about. And, one of the things that we've seen, because actually the ability to do board evaluations electronically has always existed within the board portals platform. But what we've seen is that it's really moved away from something that public companies were doing almost by rote because they felt that they had to, which was very much of a check-the-box sort of mentality, and even just recycling the same forms every year. And we've seen, much higher level of engagement, and also Suzanne was talking about the ability, the interest in private companies in doing it as well. And of course, this is, this all focuses on improved corporate governance and, what companies are trying to get out of their boards. Because, also as Susan was saying, or what I'm going to take off of what Susan was saying was that there's just such more focus on boards now, and their direct involvement in companies, and improving the bottom lines and process and evaluation of board members. What we see is the advantages to doing it electronically is there's a certain level of security that comes to it, because it's not a matter of filling out pieces of paper. There's a different level of security. There's a different level of engagement, because there can be, a convenience factor for, someone being able to, if it's a board member, starting to be able to fill out a questionnaire, and then maybe give it some more thought, be able to come back to it, not have to do it all in one go, have an ability to reflect on things, work on their answers over a period of time, not just be presented with a piece of paper that they might have to fill out in a limited period of time. But also something that really, increases the ability for engagement between the company, distributing a questionnaire, maybe supporting materials, giving that person time to fill it out, maybe also being able to refer back to, the questionnaire that I submitted the previous year, maybe reviewing some of my answers then, thinking about, how things have changed, whether or not it's the same questions or different questions. So, for us in the electronic world, what we see is the electronic distribution of board evaluations gives a higher level of engagement, yet in a very secure manner.
Well, let's take a look at what the audience does. This is amongst the segment of our audience that does do formal board evaluations. Just over half still just do a written questionnaire. So just over half is a written questionnaire. Online only is a small slice, less than 10%, or 8.3%. About 14% is oral only oral. And finally, just over a quarter, 26%, do both oral and written or online, a mix. So that's an interesting sample there. Well, let's move on now, and Suzanne, maybe you could pick up where we left off in terms of designing a board evaluation. Another decision is whether or not to use a third-party facilitator.
Sure, but one comment with respect to the poll, Neil, I'd like to make. I think that the responses show that there is no one right model out there, that it's going to depend upon the size and the type of the company, and that you really have to look at what the needs are of your particular company. With respect to third-party facilitators, again, that's going to depend upon your company. Obviously, it takes a commitment of resources to hire an external party, and you need to decide whether or not that's within your budget. I think you can do an effective evaluation using somebody in-house, as well as using someone external. But the pros of using a third-party facilitator shows external stakeholders and shareholders that the board takes the process seriously, or could show, and is willing to commit resources to the evaluation process. So that, I think, is one strong reason that you might want to use an external party. I think it also encourages, people to be, especially if it's oral interviews, encourages a bit more candor from folks, and as well as it allows the opportunity for the conversation to be done in a confidential manner, as opposed to, with respect to using somebody internally, there might be a concern that more people within the corporation would know. So, those are some pros. I think, obviously, the negatives with respect to a third-party facilitator, are cost, lack of flexibility potentially, and lack of company knowledge by that facilitator. So there are pros and cons.
And then, of course, the topics to cover. This is the crux of it, isn't it? And one of the hardest things to do.
Absolutely. And all board evaluations have to cover key topics. You're looking for specific experience and skills of directors, what the flow of communication is with management, thoughts on board size. There are absolutely very certain categories that you want to make sure are included in your evaluation.
Okay, well, let's move swiftly along. And this slide is drawn from Susan's document of key considerations when designing a board evaluation. And these are some general things to consider going into it, right, Susan?
Absolutely, Neil. And I agree with Suzanne. The right method it varies greatly from company to company. And I think if you're doing a good job, it also varies year to year for the same company. And some of the things that I think about when my clients are asking me what method to use include the board culture and personalities. Usually people are more candid in an oral interview, and I particularly like the ability to ask right at the time if you need a little more color around a certain comment or a certain score, to probe a little bit to be sure that you're understanding it correctly. It can be a little bit harder to circle back from the written materials, and directors don't always remember precisely what led them to make a particular comment or give a score. So that real-time truing up and verifying is important. I also like to really probe on the current environment. If a board is stable and everything's working well, the questions are going to be very different than if the company or the industry is in a state of flux or challenge. And staffing and support is another important thing. I've had a couple of clients that had a board leader think that they wanted to lead the process and got about halfway through, and all of a sudden things got bogged down because the right amount of support hadn't been assigned to keep notes and track of what was going on and start preparing reports. And so that can be another important thing to consider when you're changing methods.
Some great points there, Susan. I like your point about to really consider about what's happening with the company, with this industry. It may be that the company has just gone through a board refreshment, and that's going to color the evaluation process. So perhaps it went through a merger and has had a real refreshment of the board through that. Perhaps it's its business might be expanding internationally, and so it needs a focus on international things like that. So there's a lot of considerations. Let's move on now and start to talk about some of the challenges to effective board evaluations. Suzanne, you've listed a number of them here. Walk us through. Suzanne, perhaps are you on mute? Are you there?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute, trying to not have the background noise. Okay, in 2014, I think it's important, PwC came out with their annual corporate director survey. And what was very telling from that was that nearly 2/3 of all directors see evaluations at least partially as check-the-box exercise. That's problematic because that can lead to ineffective evaluations. So I think that we as in-house attorneys and part of the corporate secretary function need to think about how you address that mentality with the directors, because that's obviously a challenge to effective board evaluations. So I would recommend that people think about that. Resistance to individual self-evaluations or peer evaluations. You always have, with respect to any of these types of processes, the challenge of getting people to speak freely. You have to think about, how do you document? We've talked about the litigation risk, and then how do you implement any recommendations. But board evaluations can be so valuable when it comes time when people are stepping off the board because they have reached the age limit or have made a decision that they want to leave. Previous board evaluations identifying, risks, weaknesses within the composition of the board can help inform you with respect to the new board members that you are identifying to join the team.
Okay, one thing that I found very helpful in leading a board to implement some changes from their self-evaluation is to encourage them to just pick one or two high-priority items. Sometimes people come away with a list of 20 items that came up, and that can be a little overwhelming, and so I encourage them to pick just one or two key issues and go ahead right there and assign someone to be in charge of the action plan, whether it's a committee leader from the board or the corporate secretary or the CFO, but go ahead and get the ball rolling on those items.
That's a good idea, Susan, but I think we also, as in-house, need to be cognizant that if other recommendations have come up, you need to have an action plan as to what you're going to do, because they can become litigation liabilities down the road if you don't have a plan in place of how to address them.
And it's all in how you write the report, too.
Absolutely.
Great points. And Jeffrey, there's a couple of points on this screen, on this slide about challenges that relate to portals. So talking here about the candor and the information gathering, maybe there's is there a possibility there of anonymity? And then there's also the discoverability of materials and litigation risks. There's options that may be available now using technology around whether it's anonymity with access to results and, of course, discoverability and records retention that portals can speak to, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Neil, because, one of the things about diligent board books is that it does give you those options, and it does preserve the ability of if you want to give people the ability to respond anonymously so that there is anonymity to responses, you can do that. Now, that may not always be appropriate in the board evaluation, but if there's a variety of questionnaires or evaluations going on, anonymity has always been an option that we have, as well as that even though the system is an electronic means of distributing materials, it's not actually adding any liability or litigation risks to our clients. That is, the retention of documents, any notes or any records, these are all at the control of the client. And you can be many clients may be choosing to save the information because they want to refer back to it, but it's also something that can be passing through the system as well. So, I mean, of course, this gets into, the complications of, individual company requirements or regional requirements, but our system has always had these mechanisms built into it. And, Neil, I know we don't have a lot of time left, and I just wanted to just maybe ask Suzanne and Susan to just amplify one point about, the ownership of this process. I mean, obviously, different companies have different ways of doing it, but, I mean, if you're looking at driving a process where, you really are trying to get, full engagement from your board and something where there's action plans, I mean, who is the owner of this? Is it the corporate secretary? Is it the chairman? Is it the lead director? I mean, who's really running the process?
Here at our company, it's the corporate secretary and his supporting staff, and then the other members of my legal team, our head of corporate governance, going forward will be running that, and that's a different role for us than corporate secretary. So it's clearly management with the direction and guidance of the chairman of the board.
Mm-hmm. And when I was in-house, three of the four companies did it the way that Suzanne just mentioned, and a fourth one actually had the head of HR support the board on the evaluation process. With my clients in today's environment, I would say it's about 50-50 between the chair of the nominating committee being the main driver of both the design and the action plan versus someone from the C-suite, often the corporate secretary.
Mm-hmm.
Great point. Okay. Let's go on now to a final area, and this is something I'm quite curious about in terms of disclosure. And I'm curious to see in the next round of proxy statements next year whether we're going to start to see more information about board evaluations, considering there's such focus on board renewal and board skills. Suzanne, it's still an uncommon practice, really, to disclose even the practice, never mind the results of board evaluations, right?
Correct. In the United States. It's interesting. In Canada, there appear to be more companies there that have begun to include detailed disclosures about their board evaluation processes in their proxy statements. But here in the U.S., it is uncommon. Yes.
And Susan, it sounds as though you've been talking to some investor groups recently that are very curious to know what you're doing around board evaluations and wish they knew more about what's happening at companies, right?
Yes, there's a great deal of curiosity, and there's also some relief that boards are moving forward to tie the evaluations to value creation. I think investors really want to hear about that. So I'm encouraging my clients, if they don't want to put a lot of detail in the proxy statement, to maybe just talk about it when they're out engaging with investors, or perhaps put something on the website.
Great. Okay. So be curious to see what happens going forward. Well, we're going to be taking questions from the audience. I'd encourage the audience, if you want to click on the question button. I have a couple already in the queue. There's a good first one, actually, to start with here, and that's to do with management's role in all of this. Now, Susan, you've alluded to when and if management might be involved, and this is the question here. The board has asked, this question says, our board has asked management to provide input back to the board as part of the board evaluation. Have you seen this done? Any best practices? What do you see in this area, Susan?
Yes, I would say about a third of my clients actually have me add a component on where I survey people in the C-suite and anyone else who directly interacts with the board, so head of internal audit, corporate secretary, et cetera, as well as the senior leadership team. And I prefer some companies just use the same questions and have the executive score them. I think it works a little better if you design specific questions trying to get at whether the executives feel that they clearly understand what the board expects from them, and to identify any roadblocks to either being transparent with the board or responsive when the board wants something. And often directors are very happy to get input that maybe they're asking for a certain kind of data that's very burdensome to prepare and could be given in an easier way. It's often an easy way for executives to raise something without it being them saying no or I'd rather not directly to a director, but it can unblock a lot of processes and help streamline them.
Okay. Now, there are a couple of questions from the audience relating to some of the technical aspects of creating evaluation forms that I think Diligent they'll respond to directly to the questioners. But here's a good question, and perhaps I could direct this to Suzanne, and that is, what is the connection between your board evaluation questionnaire and the skills matrix that your company is developing?
I think there's a very close connection, and certainly I mentioned before that our company is undergoing a realignment and a restructuring here with respect to all of our operations and management, and we are at a point with respect to our board where we have a number of people who are leaving the board after many years of valuable service. These board, as we're looking at the skills for the future for management, we're also looking at skills that we need at the board level. For instance, cybersecurity expertise. I mean, this is an area that corporations, a challenge that corporations are facing. I had mentioned, Neil, before that we're a company that we know that we've been hacked into, and we've cooperated with the FBI on a recent some indictments that were announced against a sovereign nation's government officials. But yet that's not a skill set that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people thought that they needed on the board. It's something we need today. It's something everybody needs today, to have board members that have that background and that expertise. So board evaluations become critical with respect to that matrix, looking at where the board sees themselves, and we're looking at the skill set as what we think we need, and marrying the two together to come up with the right profile for new board members.
Okay, and then here's a good question. There's a good last question for Susan. For a board that has undergone significant turnover over the last 2 years, what would be a logical approach to the evaluation, or what would be the objective of the evaluation?
I think if you can confirm with board leadership and the C-suite executives that the turnover has built a board with the skills that it needs for the future, then you can go right into working on things like, is the new board coming together well as a collaborative body? Do they have enough education and knowledge of the business, or would some board education be helpful to make sure they have the knowledge they need to act quickly if there's a big opportunity or a particular challenge that might come up while they're still getting used to working together as a new group?
Okay, and just to wrap up, Jeffrey, I mean, this is to draw a line under this. This is not a check-the-box exercise anymore by any means, isn't it? Board evaluations are clearly being taken very seriously. There are challenges, but there are also very smart approaches, right?
Yeah, there absolutely are, and it's something that we have a lot of experience with and work with our clients on, helping them build and customize their questionnaires so that, if they need to be able to reuse them, they always can, but also so that each go-round can be, a new, fresh, and exciting venture.
Good.
Neil, well, I think it's important to say that corporations cannot afford not to take board evaluation process seriously. We all need to take it seriously.
It's a very good point, Suzanne, and not just for governance reasons or for shareholder pressure. It comes back to Susan's first point about there being real business drivers. This is being about value creation as well, right, Susan?
Exactly.
Good. Okay. Well, let's conclude there. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, very quick, but thank you very much for getting such a lot of information into a short amount of time. Suzanne Rich Folsom from U.S. Steel, Susan Allen Wolf, CEO of Global Governance Consulting, and Jeffrey Powell from Diligent Board Member Services. Pleasure talking to you all, and thank you very much to our audience for listening. Goodbye.